You hear that? That's not good. That is the sound of my starter failing. A car engine is an incredible machine with many carefully choreographed moving parts that all work together to keep the wheels spinning. How does it get going? A small electric motor that can drive either a flywheel on a manual transmission or the flex plate on an automatic. These sit between the engine and the transmission. Among other things, they help kick off that symphony of explosions. Now, the mechanic I took it to quoted me about $1,100 for him to do the work. I remember thinking to myself, you know what? I could probably just do it myself. So I decided to try it. I have a Land Cruiser, but my friend has the Lexus version, which should be essentially the same, and I could pester him into loaning me his repair manual. That said, this repair should be the same for anything with a 2UZ FE engine. Land Cruiser, Lexus truck SUVs, some of the 4Runners, Tundras, and Sequoias of the early 2000s. Quick disclaimer, I'm sorry for the poor video and suboptimal audio quality. I did what I could. I generally don't want to do straight instructional stuff, but this seemed useful. I did my best to include everything, but I may have missed something or gotten stuff wrong. Consult your manual or just pay a mechanic to do it and save yourself the frustration. If there's a plastic cover on your engine, take it off. Then the first step is to remove the accelerator cable. Unscrew the tension mount and then remove the cable from the throttle body. Next, pull off the intake air connector and that whole air intake assembly. There are several tubes you need to pull off: the evap hose, air hose, PCV hose, the second air hose, and a couple bolts. When that's off, the next step is remove intake manifold assembly. Seriously? There are only 3 steps before start disassembling your engine? Anyway, that's this big hunk of metal. First, we need to disconnect a bunch of connectors. Well, first disconnect your battery. I forgot to do this for the first hour or so. Thankfully, I didn't blow my airbags. Then the connectors. There are the throttle position sensor connector, accelerator pedal position sensor connector, the APPS, throttle motor connector, the VSV connector for evap, 8 injector connectors and 8 ignition coil connectors, because this is an old school V8. Aha! These are really delicate. I actually went in with some pick tools and very carefully unclipped these. The ECT sensor, the water sender gauge, which is just below the ECT sensor, and according to the manual, there are 2 O2 oxygen sensor connectors. I never found these. I thought they were underneath the intake manifold. If you know where they are, great. After the connectors, there are a bunch of hoses that need disconnecting. These carry things like coolant and fuel. You probably should be really careful to not spill their contents. Plug them up after disconnecting and work in a very well-ventilated area. You definitely do not want to leave these things to generate fumes in your tiny attached one-car garage. The hoses confused me for a while, especially the fuel pressure regulator vacuum hose. I ended up discussing the fuel return hose instead, which is something. Anyway, you want to disconnect the PCV hose from the PCV valve on the left-hand cylinder head, the evap hose from the VSV for evap to the charcoal canister, the evap hose from the evap pipe on the intake manifold that goes to the charcoal canister, the evap hose from the evap pipe on the intake manifold to the intake air connector, and the PS air hose from the intake manifold. Having done that, there are wire harnesses on both sides of the engine that run back to front. The injector and ignition coil connectors hang off of these. They have little plastic clamps that mount onto metal posts and onto the intake manifold, and you'll want to gently pry these off. If you break them, you'll have to resort to the classic mounting technology, zip ties. There's also the water bypass hose that connects to the front water bypass joint. This is immediately below the throttle body. I missed this and had to disconnect it when the intake manifold was partially suspended above the engine bay. It worked out for me, but you should probably be aware of it. At the back of the engine bay, there's a large plastic box. This is the engine wire protector. It has a ton of mounting points and is very much in the way of accessing the starter. I forgot to unbolt this. It would probably have made the job a lot easier if you removed 2 bolts and disconnect the engine wire protector from the rear water bypass joint and right-hand cylinder head, remove the guide for the AT bracket, whatever that is, from the left-hand cylinder head, and then remove 2 ground cables from the left-hand cylinder head. You also want to remove the engine wire protector on the driver's side of the intake manifold. It's held in place with 2 bolts, and it's this separate black box that also has wires coming off of it. The instructions say to remove the evap pipe held onto the intake manifold with 2 bolts here. I just left it on. There didn't seem a point in taking it off. And now, time to remove the actual assembly. It's held in place with 4 nuts in the corner, and then 3 bolts on either side for a total of 6. Oh, also remove the PCV hose. For me, I wanted to replace this hose and a lot of the other hoses because they're starting to show their age, but they should be okay for the time being. Oh, I've been using this egg carton to store my bolts. It helps keep them organized and stops me from scattering them across the garage floor like a bull in a china shop. I spilled something. Oh dear. Wear gloves. At this point, and with much consideration, I moved my car outside the garage. The aforementioned fumes were really starting to concern me. They're not great for you. Since the battery was disconnected and the engine wasn't in a position I could even try starting it, I had to override the transmission lock by pressing down on this little switch while the car was off. This let me put it into neutral, back it out, put it into park, and then throw some wheel chocks down behind the rear wheels, just in case. I bought a lift. There were some tubes I forgot. At this point, I had disconnected the water bypass hose, and I also disconnected this little 2-wire connector at the back of the engine. After that, I was able to get the assembly off of my car. I covered up the intake manifold holes so nothing would fall into them, which is very important. And then I placed this on a table in my little garage. So these holes are how air flows into the engine, where it mixes with the fuel and gets ignited. I think you can even see some of the valves or something in there. So you really don't want something in there because that's where the explosions happen. Anyways, now I can finally remove the starter. There's 1 bolt behind here, another behind there. This is the connector, and then here are the oxygen sensors, I think. So these 14mm bolts are a huge pain to take out. It took me hours. Once they're removed, you need to pull the starter back, rotate it a little bit, and then disconnect, unbolt, and remove the wire harness. And here we have the starter. Looks like mine was replaced at least once before. The top part has the field frame, the armature, and that's geared to the bottom half, which has the magnetic switch assembly and the starter clutch assembly. Okay, so this is the starter clutch. This is the magnetic switch assembly, so this is what pushes this thing. I think it gets pushed out, engages the starter, spins, and then retracts back in. So what can happen is this won't retract, and it'll actually stick, and that kind of looks like maybe that's happening, or maybe it's not getting pushed out far enough. It feels like, I don't know. Yeah, there, you can kind of see it can get pulled out and pushed back in. So maybe that's the noise. And then on the top, there's idler gear, bearing, an armature. So this is the actual motor that spins the whole thing, and there's a gear, idler gear that comes through. At this point, you should go purchase a new starter, ideally a Denso Remand one, original Toyota component if you can get it, and not take this apart any more than it already is, and just give it to them as your core fee. I tried taking it apart. It's a bunch of old, very easily stripped parts, and it's very difficult to get them back together. This back together, I need to slide this in, so yeah. So, out with the old, in with the new. Now I just have to follow all these steps in reverse to get this thing back together, which I'm now going to show you instead of just tell you. The harness bolts into the starter, and then you have to kind of wiggle it in until it's seated properly. I found the best way to get the mounting bolts in was to cantilever myself over the engine bay from the front, wrap my arm up and down behind that giant engine wire protector, and then, screw them in by hand. You need to torque the starter bolts to 39 Newton meters. Oh, and here you can see that the rain washed out the coolant I spilled earlier. I gotta clean that up because it's not exactly mammal friendly. Now that the starter's in, the next step is to just Install intake manifold assembly. First, clean it up a bit. There's a bunch of gunk that built up in this cavity, plus I want to wipe down these holes. Do a visual inspection of your car's engine. You don't get in her too often these days, do you? I also picked at some of this dirt and vacuumed it out to make sure nothing gets into the pistons. I'll replace the gaskets. They're a pretty tight fit. One of my new ones was barely just too small and it shattered, so I had to go and get a replacement for the replacement. The new gaskets also don't have the white paint marks the manual says will indicate orientation, but this is how the previous ones came out, so okay. Fits like especially well. It was like super hard to get on. The lift I bought isn't really long enough or tall enough for this. It keeps hitting the hood of my car, and I had to lift the leading edge of the engine assembly over into the engine bay. Then I had to do a bunch of pushing, loosening at the ropes, and finagling to get it to seat properly. You also have to pull the wire harnesses out of the way. This took a while. If you have a friend or a son, just get them to help. Take care not to break anything and drop it into the intake, which if you do, hopefully you can fish it out, if you're super lucky. This is the stage around where the regret really starts to set in. Get the bolts in place and it's in. I use these large forceps to place and initially screw in the nuts and bolts. Then I followed it up with a socket wrench. You want to make several passes around everything, gradually tightening it to make sure the gaskets are evenly compressed and form a nice seal. These need to be tightened to 18 Newton meters. Now for the home stretch. Install the evap pipe. I just left mine on. Connect the wire protector to the intake manifold with these two bolts. You'll want to reinstall those engine wire harnesses and cable clumps onto the hangers and brackets that you took them off of. If you broke the plastic mounting pieces, more zip tie. Do this on both sides. Next, you have to reinstall the wire protector to the rear water bypass joint. I didn't take mine off, so if you did, good for you. Okay, time for hoses. Note, these confused me while I tried to remember what everything was and where it should go, even with my incredible labeling job. Just reconnect everything properly. Don't make a mistake. The PCV hose connects to the front of the manifold. The fuel pressure regulator vacuum hose has to get reconnected. The fuel return hose connects to the back driver's side, little tube nozzle right there. The evap hose from the charcoal canister to the VSV for evap. The evap hose from the charcoal canister to the evap pipe on the intake manifold. The evap hose from the evap pipe on the intake manifold to the intake air connector on the other side of the engine, though this goes on later when the intake air assembly is reinstalled. And finally, the PS air hose to the intake manifold. Now, the number one throttle bypass hose from the water inlet housing to the throttle body. This is just below the intake manifold. It's difficult to reach and to connect. This is what I had to pull off after I started lifting out the manifold originally. Finally, the 2-wire clamp to the throttle body. I think that's the little 2 wires at the back. I don't really remember this. Connectors. Throttle position sensor connector. Accelerator pedal position sensor connector. These have clips to route it. I broke one and zip tied it. VSV connector for evap. 8 injector connectors. ECT sensor. Water sender gauge. 8 ignition coil connectors, which go to the spark plugs. The passenger side was nice and easy. The driver's side is much more difficult. Allegedly, the 2 oxygen sensors that need connecting, but they're still on the run. I had to connect that coolant hose I don't remember disconnecting. I think it's the lower radiator hose. I remember spilling it, but I had to kind of reroute it up and around. And then the VSV evap hose that I skipped on earlier. Finally, the accelerator cable gets routed around all the other hoses across the top of the intake manifold, under the evap hose, and then it goes back into its mount, and then you have to connect it to the throttle body. Finally, the intake air connector, which has the following hoses: the PS air hose, evap hose, air hose, PCV hose, 2 air tubes, those are giant tubes that I don't know what the name is, and then 2 bolts. Finally, reconnect the battery. Time to go start her up and... Oh. Oh my. That's bad. You could take this whole thing apart again, and then eventually give up and tow it to the mechanic. Turns out that my flex plate, which is the part the starter interfaces with, was utterly destroyed, to the extent that it ruined the mounting bolts and was about a hair's breadth away from catastrophic failure. So I actually ended up doing half the job. And the other half I wouldn't have even tried myself because you have to drop out the transmission to get to it and replace everything. So I did save myself 1100 USD, but I still ended up paying the mechanic about 1100 USD. Save yourself the effort. Do you think it was worth it?